If I can still add one thing
Sure.
that your response triggered is the idea of resistance. And I think one of the challenges I would give to managerial leaders is delete the whole idea of resistance from your vocabulary. Because I think that's been overestimated. You see, whenever you see something about change, there often is the word resistance in there.
Yes.
In my experience, and I've also studied a little bit into this topic, is very rarely it is actual resistance.
You're right.
Because resistance for me means people they really don't want to change. And they're not, you can't convince them in any way. So they just resist because they don't want to change. I think in like 90% of the cases, what you experience is not actual resistance. It's all of the other things. It's anxiety, shock, or lack of clarity.
Welcome to the Inner Game of Change podcast, where I explore the intricate layers of organizational change alongside insightful professionals. I am Ali Juma, and this is the Inner Game of Change podcast. In this episode, I am diving into great conversation with Jeroen Kraaijenbrink, a strategy thought leader who recognizes that the journey through organizational change is an emotional roller coaster, a critical aspect often overlooked in the designing and implementation of change. His well-received post on LinkedIn, Emotional Roller Coaster of Change, sheds light on the turbulent human experience that accompanies any strategic change. For leaders, acknowledging this emotional landscape is not peripheral. It is central to steering their teams effectively through change. I am grateful to have Jeroen chatting with me today. Jeroen, thank you so much for joining me in the Inner Game of Change podcast. I am very grateful for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Today we're going to talk about an exciting and interesting article you've written, which touches on the change aspect of things, and also it's called, I think, the change roller coaster. But before we get into the topic and dive deep into it, it would be fantastic to introduce yourself to my audience.
In very few words, I'm a strategy expert or a strategy person. So everything I do is very closely related to strategy, mostly strategy development, a bit of strategy implementation. And I've done that in various different roles. My first career was in academia. So I went to the university, did my PhD, became an assistant and an associate professor. And then like 14 years ago, I decided I want to have an impact on the real world and started as an independent consultant. And ever since, I've been working with companies, helping them develop and implement strategies, and also with individuals, mentoring them about business-related, leadership-related, and strategy-related topics. And besides that, I've always been writing. I have a couple of books on strategy and implementation, and very active on LinkedIn as a contributor. And that's where you found the article on the emotional roller coaster of change.
And strategy is all about change, isn't it?
It is. It's and the part that I find most interesting there is actually the very fuzzy front end, is defining what the very change should be and how to do that and how to involve your people in kind of setting the direction, in knowing what to change, rather than deciding for them what the change should be.
The image of a roller coaster is quite dizzying one. Was that your intention, is to use that imagery, and why would you use it?
Yes, very much. Actually, the image itself is not mine. I took that from someone else, and I have to be very frank here, is I don't know who the original source is. I've tried to find out.
Maybe we'll find out through this podcast.
Yeah, maybe if someone is the owner of the picture, please
let us know.
I'll add the credits. But the roller coaster part, the title is what I added, because I think the picture kind of describes a roller coaster with a looping in there. And in my experience, change, especially if it's big change, and when we talk about strategy, it's often a big change, is an emotional roller coaster, and with ups and downs, and also with like in a roller coaster, you have certain phases in there. Some are slow, some are fast, some are exciting, some are maybe not so exciting. So yeah, that was very much a purposeful decision to use that as a metaphor.
Have you been on a roller coaster yourself?
Yeah, perhaps. And this is the interesting part is how do you experience this individually? I don't think I have not experienced the changes I've gone through very much as a roller coaster, or maybe as a very boring, slow roller coaster, like the things for small kids.
Yes, yeah.
So yeah, that's I think that immediately highlights one of the aspects of change is that people differ so much in how they experience it. Some are very fond of the change and they are excited and like it most of the time. Others are quite against change. They have difficulties coping with the change and have more negative feelings all the time. So probably I'm a bit more pro-change than average. Also, if you look at my career, I've made quite a few decisions with relatively big changes, if I have to believe the people around me. But I've never felt it really like an emotional roller coaster myself.
In real life, when I went a few times in my life on a roller coaster, your article made me think about all the faces that were around me. Some of them were excited, so they see the opportunities. I was one of those people that was holding on to my seat. I wasn't too excited, but I wasn't afraid, but I was dealing with it rationally. And there were those people who were damn scared and started shouting before even the roller coaster started moving. But also during that journey, there are some really speedy bumps and there's some calm periods. And that's where the excitement is. It brings you up and down. And with each turn, it triggers certain emotions in us. Mm-hmm. And so when I was reading your article, all of those emotions started to come into my mind, thinking, I can match this with my real life experience. Mm-hmm. In your article, you did talk about the triggers, including loss, anxiety, all of these things. Mm-hmm. As a strategy thought leader, how would you think managers should be positioned to manage those triggers when we implement change or introduce change in the workplace?
Oh, that's a big question. I don't know whether I can give a satisfying answer, but let me give a try.
Sure.
I think it's probably, to a large extent, unlearning a lot of things that we have learned over time. And I think if you look at the business school, if you look at strategy, at management more generally, it has been approached very much as a rational process where you need information, then you make a decision, you implement, execute, done. Like as if an organization is a machine. And if people are kind of robots where you tell them, this is what you need to do now, and then they do that. Of course, that's not entirely or not even close how organizations are in real life and how people are in real life. Yep. And I think the main challenge for managers, leaders, is kind of forget about this very rationalistic approaches that assume an organization can just be created and designed and that people can just follow orders, and kind of step back and kind of remember what they know about people from their private lives and from themselves. So really kind of try to find the human side of themselves and think, okay, how do I respond to change? Think much more, maybe approach your organization much more as you would do with your family. If you look at your kids, you're not going to tell them and expect them to change from one day to the other. You see change as, I hope and I think you see change as a process that goes slow, where there is emotions. So basically getting in touch with more with the human side of yourself than with the studied, learned manager side and skills. I know that's not a very precise answer, but I think that's the fundamental thing is that by and large, I think we know that change is not a simple thing, is not something we can just enforce on people.
Yep.
So getting into getting in touch with the human side of things, and then more the intuitive side of things maybe as well.
So I really like that. And I haven't heard a lot of people talking about that, and I actually haven't used that myself when I talk to my clients about this. So what I hear you say is that self-reflect first is probably a good step, as self-awareness first about how you would manage change when change comes your way as a receiver of a change. That can give you a good idea about what things you need to do when you talk to your team about change. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and also we've learned to make a crystal clear distinction between here's the things you do in an organization that's called work.
Yeah.
Here's your private life, and there's a clear kind of boundary in between, which of course is a myth. There is no real boundary in between that goes both sides. There's all kind of interactions. And I think in private life, I think we know better how to deal with change naturally, and than we do in organizations. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the model you're referring to, the roller coaster, but also other models like the Kubler-Ross grief cycle, a lot of these change models are actually not so much management models, but they reflect how people deal with difficult situations privately, like a loss of maybe a relative, or facing challenging, difficult situations personally. And what we have, I think, what in many cases have not seen enough or have approached it enough in organizations is treating it as this kind of private change where there is loss, where there are feelings of loss, where there is grief, where there are emotions. So also reflect, but also look at how you cope with this yourself in your private life, and how people around you cope with change in your private life.
And so what you're saying, we don't come to work and completely detached from the person we are at home. We're still a bundle of emotions, and therefore whether management likes it or not, we're going to bring those to the workplace. And therefore managers are going to have to, when they deal with change, they're going to have to, they need to have operational patience, and the highest level of change, what I call change empathy. Very
much. And I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. And I've used this example before at other places. Is it seems like when people go to work, they kind of switch off their emotions, put their intelligence in the cabinet, and then they're just executors at work. But that's, of course, not what's the reality. They are the full person. It's also why in my newest training program on strategy, I refer to this idea of a whole person approach, whole person consulting, because there's no way you can leave out the emotional part or the creativity part or any other part of yourself. So let's just embrace that. Let's acknowledge that and treat yourself and people as whole person. And I think that's in this emotional roller coaster picture, but in many change approaches, the heart of it is treat people as people and not as objects or as robots or anything like that.
This principle and your professional advice to deal with people as a whole person, obviously from experience, you have seen that hasn't been the usual thing that usually you observe. Is that right?
Oh, unfortunately, yes.
What would be some of the observations that you observe that does contradict this whole person view? Do you have some examples?
Examples. You already mentioned, I think you call it operational patience.
Yes.
It's impatience. Or on the other side, underestimating the time it takes for people to adapt.
Yeah.
For organizations to adapt. I haven't seen, I think it's almost default in strategy that whenever you identify a new strategy, you formulate, you design the new direction, you vastly underestimate how complicated it is to make the changes.
Yeah.
And I think that means that I think one of the keys here is patience and accept that for a while people will have troubles. And patience, I also mean just let it sit for a while. So when there is a change, so you have your new strategic plan, you have developed it with a bunch of people in your organization, but not everyone. So there is a moment where there is some announcement and there will be changes. At that point in time, I think it's also sometimes just leave it for a while. Let things sink in. Let things move or not move. And that's what I like very much about this picture is the middle part, which in this picture is called transition, but it's kind of this void. And I think that's the part where we've not learned to deal with that enough. So we know, I think many managers, many leaders know on paper that, okay, there will be all the emotions, like there will be some denial, some resistance, fear, anger. They've experienced that. But what they want to do is then immediately kind of undo that and get to the other side of the roller coaster and say, okay, let's move to the energetic, the creativity part. Let's resolve that anger. And what I like about this picture is accept that there is this in-between phase, this void where people let people muddle through for a while, and then the solutions they will kind of crystallize slowly if you allow people to have some time, to take some time, to let it sink in, to digest, to process the change. And I think that's also the core message in this picture is that there is no direct shortcut. And I think having the patience and accept this in-between phase, that's for me the main lesson that I think many leaders, managers, and organizations need to remember or learn again.
So this in-between stage, you've been talking about this, and so let me share with you a couple of things. First of all, I completely agree with you. This is, in my head, I call it the playground. Let them play. So that's a transition. That's what we call the adoption stage, some stage, during the project. The complexity with this, though, Jeroen, is that a project is usually, unfortunately, time-boxed. And so a project would need to be delivered at a certain time. However, I always think that's fine, but then when the leaders will take the responsibility after the project finishes, they've got the autonomy to make those decisions and allow that embedding period for as long as you can. And you're going to achieve a few things by that. First of all, you're going to achieve the desired adoption level. Second thing, you will know a lot about your team. Third thing, that will prepare you for the upcoming changes in the future anyway. You will have a lot of insight about your team. And therefore, you can, in the future, proactively influence the timeline of a project coming your way. Am I reading too much into this, or am I on the right track here?
No, but I want to add something about the time boxing. I think it starts with including some time for this in-between period in the project. I think why are so many projects not on time, not within budgets, and so on? Part of it, of course, is just bad project management, and we have all kinds of techniques for better project management, and we're probably doing better now than in the past. But part of it, especially when it means real change for people, is we don't reserve time for this in-between phase. Well, it's the most important phase in change, in my view, because that's where the mental processing, the mindset change is happening. And that's the part where you cannot just set milestones and deliverables and all kind of that. So also in our project management approaches, we have an overemphasis on the rational part, on the economic part, on the resource part, and underestimate the people part of it, at least in my experience. So time boxing, very, very good, because change, I don't think happens when there is kind of unlimited resources, unlimited time. So that's not a solution. But make sure you are realistic in the time you set and kind of make the in-between phase or make the emotional side of change part of the project.
And that's where change management comes into place. The change manager should be able to provide guidance, depending on the insight and how much they know about the impacted group. They should provide guidance on what we call hypercare period looks like. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or 6 weeks, or whatever that is, with measurable, because that's where we say where corrective action happens and loss of support and hand-holding happens. But I think in your article, you did mention that something really important, which is creativity also happens during that period of time.
Yeah, and then that's where change. I think that's where what change is always. It's always good. And early on in the podcast, you asked whether I experienced it as an emotional roller coaster.
Yeah,
not so much, because I like the creativity part of it, and I think if you manage it well, I think many people like using their creativity, finding new solutions, thinking, so using their skills, their mindset, and so on to find better solutions. Maybe I want to go one step back before going again to creativity. I think one of the problems with change is also that it's often imposed on people rather than that they have been part of the change from the beginning on. And I see that a lot in strategy,
sure,
where strategy is developed at the top by a few people, and then it's supposed to cascade down and translate it to people, to departments, units, and so on. That creates a lot of problems because you create a gap between the thinking and the doing. You create a gap between those who decide and those who have to kind of obey. When you involve people much earlier in the process of strategy development or any big change, I think that's part of the solution to the emotional roller coaster as well, because they have been part of it. So there probably will be less of these negative, in air quote, emotions of denial, anxiety, shock, resistance, because, hey, they have been part of the process before. And also that's where the creativity part comes in. If you involve people from early on in the process in thinking about their future and thinking about the change, you can use their creativity. You can tap their intelligence, their creativity, their skills in thinking about or designing a solution. I think that's also where creativity should actually be used in the very beginning of the process, in tapping people's intelligence and creativity and thinking about the change, rather than leaving it to something popping up during the process.
And there are a lot of advantages of taking people along through the journey, Jeroen. One of the advantages is that I've never seen a project team thinking of all the possible impacts of a change. There's always going to be something later that comes up. And if you bring the people along, meaning the people that will be impacted by the change, you will iron out a lot of those impacts up front, which will save you a lot of headache and energy at the end.
Yeah, that plus also, I think we often try to kind of dictate too much or define projects too precisely, which again I can refer back to strategy. This is the traditional approach. You make a 5-year plan, then you turn it into projects and programs and so on and so on and so forth. So you completely kind of fixate it from the beginning.
Yeah.
While that's of course not the reality, because in the meanwhile the world changes as well, and you cannot anticipate everything. So it also means building in room for change in the change project itself. So, and that's where the creativity part is again very important, is once you're in the project for a couple of weeks or a month, depending on how big it is, you discover new things. There's new issues, new gaps, there's new changes. And that's the part where you have to give people the room, but also facilitate them, help them to use their creativity to think about different solutions, a change to the change.
So what's your take on approaches like Agile, which is basically incremental? You test a part of a solution and you learn and then you move on. And the other thing that I want your take on is lots of organizations now are going through what they call the MVP stage. Give us the minimal viable product and build as you progress rather than try to perfect a solution. What's your take on those two things? And will they help?
Yeah.
Will they help in the roller coaster?
Yes and no. Yes, because I think they're the iterative or incremental approaches are more flexible, more focused on bringing the thinking and the doing closely together, because in both Agile or Scrum or working with an MVP, the idea is build something fast and then test it and learn and then build the next increment, the next part, and so on.
Yeah.
So the good thing about it is it's more flexible. It's closer, less of a gap between the thinking and the doing. But it's also not necessarily the complete solution.
Yes.
Because I know, especially Agile and MVPs are super popular nowadays.
Yeah.
And I think they work very well for what exactly the MVP already says, a minimal viable product. So when you're developing a product, a solution, a piece of software, a tool, anything tangible or that you can sell or give to others, that's, I think, where the iterative or the incremental approach works very well. When you do strategy in a completely agile way or work with minimal viable products, that doesn't really work. And also because you can't just make up your strategy and then through trial and error implement it. That's when you look. That's not in this article, but in my books, especially the strategy handbook. There's a picture of a strategy process with 3 cycles in it. You need kind of an iterative cycle in the strategy development phase. Mm-hmm. So to make sure that the strategic plan you're making is as good as you can. But you also need an iterative process in the execution phase, because whenever you think you know what to do, you start executing, and then you find out, okay, this doesn't work. You're not going to revisit your strategy immediately. You're going to try something else and still something else. And then after 3 or 4 things, if that doesn't work, then you might go back and revisit your strategy.
Yes.
So basically you have single loop learning in the strategy development phase. You have single loop learning in the strategy execution phase. And then there's double loop learning in between those phases. And this is and I've been thinking about this a lot when writing the book, is this tension between linearity and kind of cyclical thinking. And I think where Agile and Scrum and minimal viable products, they're very well in the cyclical, the short cycle approach. But ideally in strategy, you still want a linear approach. You want to be right the first time, knowing that this is impossible, but you want to do it as good as you can. So that's why this kind of combination of, you might say, an agile approach within strategy development and an agile approach within strategy execution, but in between them as linear as possible, because otherwise it's too costly, too problematic for an organization to just do trial and error with a new strategy.
What I also find, and to add to that, especially in the iterative process, if it's not done well, some project teams, they do it really well and they keep people very informed. But I've seen examples where the project team focuses on the technicality of the iterative process and then not really the people side. And it can be quite disruptive to a lot of teams, because you need to come to the teams again and again with the new implementations and the layers of implementation. So we're going to have to be mindful of all of those things. But I take your point is that the disconnect is that those strategies are short-term, shorter cycle, and the strategy is supposed to be medium to long-term cycle.
Yeah, that's the whole point. That's where the whole idea of strategy comes from, to give some long-term stability. And if we make that completely agile, we basically throw out the baby with the bathwater and say, okay, we can't do strategy. Maybe a way to kind of avoid making the hard choices. And I think that's a very important part of strategy, that you have to make hard choices that will have a big impact on at least some people in the organization. And agile is kind of a nice way of avoiding making those choices and kind of hoping that organically they will come up at some point in time. So yes, there are lots of advantages, but also some caveats here when you think about agile in relation to strategy and change.
Fantastic. I'm really enjoying this conversation. I'm learning a lot, actually, making me think about a lot of things that I have, validated a few things as well that I've been thinking about. I want to ask you if, as a change manager and a change practice manager myself, when it comes to change, especially around the transitional stage, we've already talked about that allow some time. But for me as a change manager, what would be your advice to me and people like myself when it comes to change, so we can take people along the way? What would be your advice when it comes to the most important thing in the change cycle? Where would we focus our effort on?
That's another challenging question. I think that the real answer is the patient part. So give it the time. I think that's the most important thing. But maybe it's listen. Listen and look at your people. And I'm saying that because when you carefully listen to what people are saying and what they're not saying, if you look at people and see how they are struggling, you also see the differences between them. And that, I think, that touches upon another issue with a lot of change management approaches, is we're treating it as if there's kind of a one-size-fits-all thing. We have a project, there's people, and everyone has to move along in the same way. But that's not the reality. People are very different, as we have already discussed. So probably have a closer look at the individual people in your team, and see which of them are at which stage. So you might even use a picture and say, and kind of map who this week is in which phase of the picture, and how can I best help them to get through that phase to the next phase.
What you're saying here is that, which I always think about in my practice, is that I should never take anything for granted. That emotions go up and down and they change from day to day. So I gotta have to respect that, which means I would need to be, dialing up my change empathy every single day. I would need to show the highest level of empathy when it comes to, even sometimes we communicate and we engage with people, and then there's always going to be some people saying, I didn't know this was coming. The natural reaction, if I don't have the patience, is to say, well, tough, we've already done that. But then the professional, the empathetic side of me saying, yep, okay, well, we've already allowed some time in the change plan. We've got the luxury of time now to come back and check in with some other people if we need to, because the end result matters more than the timeline. And what you're also saying is that, what I hear you say anyway, is that there's a high level of volatility every day. These people still do their jobs, still have challenges within their jobs. And then perhaps they've got a new manager, or their manager's manager changed. All of those elements, they impact these people throughout the journey. So we have to be, this is why there's sensitivity around the whole process is very fragile. And if you're going to put it on a timeline or a linear process, you're already doomed to fail.
Yeah, if I can still add one thing,
sure.
that your response triggered, is the idea of resistance. And I think one of the challenges I would give to managerial leaders is delete the whole idea of resistance from your vocabulary. Because I think that's been overestimated. You see, whenever you see something about change, there often is the word resistance in there.
Yes.
In my experience, and I've also studied a little bit into this topic, is very rarely it is actual resistance.
You're right.
Because resistance for me means people they really don't want to change. and you can't convince them in any way, so they just resist because they don't want to change. I think in like 90% of the cases, what you experience is not actual resistance. It's all of the other things. It's anxiety, shock, or lack of clarity. Yeah. When people resist, again in air quotes, the change, it's often a sign that you have not been clear or you have not followed the right process. Try to avoid the whole idea of resistance. And I think when you try to avoid that, then you're getting into what you mentioned, the empathy. And what I mean with listening and looking is try to find out what's really making that people have difficulties with the change. It's probably not resistance. It's probably something else.
Yeah, well, resistance, one part of it, one interpretation of the word resistance is a lack of information. But also one thing that I've been thinking about recently, I also would like people, practitioners and managers to drop the word that people don't like change. That may be true to some people, but certainly that's half truth. That's not the whole truth. I also think that the whole truth is that some people in an organization, they don't mind the change, but they've lost credibility in the way we manage change in the workplace anyway.
Yes.
And so sometimes, similar to you, and I think your first sentiment about the manager, look at yourself first and go through your own self-reflection first. I think as a change practice, we should take part of that responsibility and blame because some of us do manage change really well and pay a lot of attention, and some of us go through the motion and tick it off as if it's an activity that it needed to be done and my job is done and your job is never done. When it comes to change.
Very much I think we've made change. I think maybe change is more a problem that we have created because of the way we've managed companies and we've managed change.
Right,
again, in this rational, non-human way. Then that it's something inherent in people. And that's like with resistance. I don't think people generally resist change. It's because you have done something wrong in how you manage the change that you kind of made them resist the change. So again, look at yourself. Whatever you see happening with your people, ask yourself, what have I done wrong, or what could I have done better in order to really help them move to the next phase with the team, with the organization, or individually.
Know thyself. Isn't that what Aristotle said?
Yeah, that's
know thyself
it is the important part of this.
Which is really very difficult. What do they say? They say we judge others by their actions and we judge ourselves by our intentions. And there's a reason for saying that is because it's hard to judge ourselves by our own actions. And but I hope that listeners and managers, once you step into a manager's and a leader's position, you've got the responsibility to have that capability and capacity to think through your own lens with the highest level of empathy when it comes to change in the workplace. And I completely agree with you, Jeroen. Resistance is quite misleading. We're just going to have to look at how much have we contributed to the problem and most importantly, what we can do now, today, to try to change that. I call that, and in my practice, I focus on the change experience, because if I do everything right and I allow them in that playground transition space and I've taken them throughout the journey with me, I create a positive change experience. And only through positive change experience, I'll create faith in the system. And so next time there's a change, there's more likelihood that the team will really understand, accept, and adopt that change rather than putting up a barrier or fight against it.
Yeah, that's maybe the last thing I would like to add as well is it's called for an emotional roller coaster also for another reason. We've talked mostly about, let's say, the hard parts of change, but most people go like roller coasters because they're fun. And if you look at the right half of the picture, all of that about creativity, acceptance, impatience, hope, energy, enthusiasm is the bright side of change. And I think that's the part that we might forget by focusing too much on the problems, is that good change can be great. It can be motivating, inspiring, energizing. So if we see change as an emotional roller coaster from those two sides, so there's the scary parts, but also the fun parts, I think then we can really make progress in how we manage change.
I like that. Change for me is an invitation for growth. And that's really the underpinning principle behind change. We need B can be better than A. And therefore, we're going to make some changes and actually try to help people move from A to B. I like that. So there's a scary part of the roller coaster, but there's the exciting, fun part. Depends on how you make that experience finish at the end of the ride, I suppose. Thoroughly enjoying this conversation, Jeroen. It made me think about quite a few things, and which I will add to my forte of knowledge and experience when I talk about change and when I practice change as well within my portfolio. We are coming close to the end of the podcast. I would like you to talk to me very quickly about the books that you've written.
Yeah, there's a couple of them. One is the Strategy Handbook. That's the book where I kind of basically outline my complete approach to strategy with the single and double loop learning that I already talked about.
Yes.
So there's kind of the double roller coaster, if you like. So that's really a detailed handbook for how to do strategy in practice. There's another book, Strategy Consulting, which is a short book basically outlining my views on what strategy consulting is like and what it is and what it's not. My most recent book is The 1 Hour Strategy, which is my attempt to kind of create an idea, create a picture of how can we make strategy a normal part of a company. Mm-hmm. Not something exceptional, not something done by just the top of the leadership, but by literally everyone in the company. So how can we make strategy development and execution a normal part of the everyday business? I think that also relates very much to the whole conversation we had today, because if you do that, people are naturally part of the continuous change that you go through as an organization. So those are the 3 books that are probably most relevant to the audience here.
Fantastic. We're going to put all the information about your books in the podcast information. It's been a pleasure having you in my Inner Game of Change podcast, Jeroen, today. How would people connect and reach out to you?
The easiest way is probably on LinkedIn. So if you search my name, and I'm sure in the podcast you have written my name somewhere. If you Google it, if you type it, there is just one Jeroen Kraaijenbrink. So you will arrive at me. There's my website, jeroenkraaijenbrink.com. So those are the easiest way to find me.
The only Jeroen Kraaijenbrink in the world. So I'm really glad to have you in my podcast today. It's been a pleasure having you. I hope I can get you back, and I'm certainly buying the 1 hour strategy, because that will help me, equip me, have those conversations with the leaders as well. Jeroen, it's been a pleasure having you in my podcast. Until next time, stay well and stay safe.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening. If you found this episode valuable, remember to subscribe to stay updated on upcoming episodes. Your support is truly appreciated. And by sharing this podcast with your colleagues, friends, and fellow change practitioners, it can help me reach even more individuals and professionals who can benefit from these discussions. Remember, and in my opinion, change is an enduring force, and you will only have a measure of certainty and control when you embrace it. Until next time, thank you for being part of the Inner Game of Change community. I am Ali Jama, and this is the Inner Game of Change podcast.
I think it was good,
isn't
it?
It was fun.
I liked it.